Good morning, everyone. Really excited to welcome you back to the main stage at the Department of Dreams Re-Festival. Really excited to have our next two speakers on. Over the last few years, particularly for me, in very uncertain times at a national level, Matthew and Anthony and their thinking and the way they synthesize what we need to do more urgently and some of the bigger plays has really inspired me. So I'm excited to hear from Matthew and Anthony today. I just want to tell you a little bit about them. So I can see already in the chat people are from who are RSA fellows and who know the RSA well are here. So welcome to you all. Matthew is the chief executive of the RSA. And he's been the chief exec since 2006. And Anthony Painter is the chief research and impact officer at the RSA as well. Some of you might remember Anthony's TEDx Brum Talk a few years ago and his really important work on basic income. So some of you will be familiar with that work. So we're really excited to bring that all together. Sorry we started a bit late. We're just going to have a slightly shorter Q&A, but that means you need to get your questions in early. Just as I hand over, I just wanted to say why we've invited Anthony and Matthew. I think one of the most important things in the last couple of days that people have been saying is, in order to really access their dreams and the bold visions that they have for the future, there's also sort of pragmatic plans about how we move out of this time that they're really craving as well. And, you know, I see that a lot when Anthony releases something about basic income. People are like, yeah, but what about this and what about that? And so a couple of weeks ago, it was really nice to read the blog that had come out about, you know, what's a practical 12 months out of this? How might we approach it? What things do we need to value? And how does that fit in to a much bigger story of recovery or renewal or revolt or whatever is happening, the many things that we've talked about in this Re-Festival, how many things need to be true, and we need to hold both the plurality, the pragmatics of the next year, as well as the bold visions for the future in balance, because we know we have a lot to do and not a long time to be able to do it. So on that note, I'm really, really excited to welcome Anthony and Matthew. I'm going to slip into the backstage and I'll come back for questions in about half an hour. Thanks so much, Matthew and Anthony. Hope you have a great chat. Well, thanks, Immy.
I'm actually going to use this time to try to float a new idea. The overwhelming likelihood is that I'll have forgotten about this idea by next Thursday. But there's a small possibility that this idea might be one which travels a bit and gains some momentum, in which case you heard about it first here, because it's something I've been thinking about for a while and it's kind of coalesced this morning. So I'm not, Immy, you referred to the piece that Anthony and I wrote, the blog we wrote a couple of weeks ago about kind of year of stabilization. And I'm not going to talk about that. Anthony might talk about it a bit more. What I would say about that blog post, which obviously people can read, is that some of the ideas in it have been powerful and are reflected in some of the things that the government is doing. I'm not saying that we caused that, but we kind of, what we thought needed to happen has in some senses happened. But the core idea has failed, and you know, that's fine. I think that you push ideas out there sometimes to see if they succeed, and the core idea was that rather than a continuous process of every day announcing some new bit of relaxation of the rules, and so people never quite know what the next bit's going to be, and there's always a danger if the virus comes back again of having to then go back to take a backward step. We instead argued for saying, well, look, unless there is a cure or a vaccine on the one hand, or the R rate goes kind of way above 1, we should just assume that things will be in a stable position for a year, and we should have a set of measures which we say we're going to stick to for a year, so that people can plan on the basis that they kind of know that's where we're going to be. And as I say, that argument hasn't been successful. And one of the things it was premised on, for example, was a consistent social distancing regime, and I think most of us are expecting the social distancing regime to change at any moment. I'm only kind of saying all of that because I think that we have to recognize, the key idea I want to get across really is about an openness to thinking self-critically. So I want to start by saying we were going to talk about a blog which has been partly successful, but in essence probably it hasn't been. Who knows? Maybe in 6 months' time, people will look back and say, if only we had a year of stabilization. Who knows? But it's not what's happened. Anyway, that's a kind of preamble. What I want to talk about is what is the age we might be going into, or that we should want to be going into. And I'll do that very schematically because I've only got kind of 8 minutes left. But I hope at the heart of this there's an intriguing idea. So the framing of this is a pretty simple, highly kind of generalized way of understanding the last kind of 70 years in the West. And that is to say that we have had a series of shocks which have contributed to, which have partly reflected and partly contributed to the end of a particular dominant model for thinking about politics and society. So the Depression and the Second World War is a crisis which leads to the post-war settlement, which then lasts for around kind of 30 years. And when we look back on that post-war settlement, it looks pretty positive in comparison to today, in the sense of pretty steady growth of the economy and productivity, but also relatively low levels of inequality, growing levels of freedom, and, authority government, relatively kind of self-confident, relatively consensual politics. We then have the oil shock, which it wasn't in itself and never is a crisis in itself enough to lead to a kind of regime change. But the crisis is partly happens because of the fragility of the regime, but it's also the kind of catalytic point that leads to the beginning of the end of the regime. So the oil shock in the 1970s, stagflation that was being experienced in many Western economies, the changes of policy in America in relation to its role in the global economy. This then gives rise to neoliberalism. It gives rise to a different regime, a regime dominated by the assumption that markets and that a particular model of individualism is the most powerful way of achieving human progress. That system has all sorts of problems. It's not imposed uniformly. None of these systems are ever imposed uniformly. I'm talking about the kind of dominant system, but not the universal system. Neoliberalism then meets its crisis through the global financial meltdown. And that then starts to see the rise of the era of populism. Important to say populism existed before the global financial crisis. The global financial crisis leads to this era when populism becomes, as it were, the kind of dominant, or at least the most dynamic kind of model of politics and social change. And now populism is very dynamic, but it's also very contradictory, very problematic. And so it's perhaps not surprising if the populist era doesn't last as long as other eras have lasted. And so it could be that we look back on the pandemic as the point at which that system, this short, dynamic, chaotic, deeply problematic system, loses its kind of momentum, and we move into a new era. So what is that new era? So I'm only going to describe it very briefly, but there's an underpinning bit of theory that I need to give you before I describe it. So the underpinning bit of theory, and this is a set of ideas that actually have a very long history in sociology, anthropology, but you can see them echoed actually in psychology and other systems, and that I've been playing with for many years, the RSA's been using. So the underlying theory here is that it's useful to think of societies, organizations, places, in terms of the idea that there are three fundamental motivations for human behavior. So there are three fundamental things that drive us as individuals, which are then expressed as forces in organizations and in societies. And those three forces are authority, because one of the core motivations we have as individuals is we do what we're told. And a lot of the time we do what we're told. Even people who think they're terribly rebellious actually spend most of their time doing what they're told. The second force is the force of belonging. So the stuff that we do because of the tribe that we are part of, the values that we have, the kind of people, the kind of group of people we want to be one of. And that's also a very powerful reason why we do what we do. And probably actually in the kind of academic world, you know, the world of kind of social psychology and sociology, the last 20 years has been a kind of rediscovery of the importance of tribe, solidarity, belonging, identity as a driver of human behavior. And then the third force, which is the force that neoliberalism said was really the only force that mattered, is our own personal preferences, the things we want for ourselves, the aspirations that we have. Now, crudely, this can be overlaid as state, civil society, and market. But actually, within the state, these three forces express themselves within civil society, within the organization, indeed, even within each individual. I would say you could think about your own life as the balance in your life between the things that you do because, as it were, you're pursuing some kind of hierarchical notion of authority and progression, the things that you do because of your values and your tribe, and the things that you do just because you want to do them. So the theory says, if these are the three fundamental things that drive human behavior, and there's lots of evidence to suggest that there is, or this is a useful way of thinking, the most dynamic systems, the most dynamic organizations are the ones that combine them. Because why would you not want to use a form of deep human motivation? So the most dynamic systems are ones which summon up our willingness to be led, our willingness to do things because we belong, and our willingness or desire to do things because they fit into our own story about our own aspirations, our own kind of life narrative. But, and this is the critical thing, that is difficult to do. And it is difficult to do because each of these forces is, on the one hand, perhaps there's going to be three hands here, so I won't use hands. Each of these forces is firstly, in a way, driven by its critique of the others. So hierarchy is partly driven by the sense that it needs to drive people forward to break them out of their tribalism and to deal with their difficult individualism in pursuit of a kind of hierarchical objective. Similarly, tribe is a critique of authority. Solidaristic groups are always critical and suspicious of authority and suspicious of individualism, its selfishness and its kind of anarchy. And individualism, of course, thinks that kind of belonging is cloying and holds us back and is backward looking, and that hierarchy is overbearing. So firstly, the critiques of each other as ways of thinking. Secondly, they're internally problematic. Each one of them has got profound internal contradictions, which I haven't got time to get into here, but each one does. And then thirdly, even if you do have a system which holds them together, it's really dynamic, an organization where authority, belonging, and individual aspiration all go together. These things happen in an environment, and the environment will then come along, a crisis will come along, something will happen, and it will upset the balance, and you'll then have to re-find it. And I would say that although in one level, this idea of these three forces combining seems very simple, overwhelmingly, we don't get it right. Overwhelmingly, organizations don't express these three things. They don't hold them in tension. It becomes unbalanced. One isn't expressed. They are in conflict in societies as well. So this brings me to my final point. My final point is, what is the system that emerges after COVID? And I want to give the system that I would like to see emerge a name, and I want to call it the reflexive age. I'm sorry, it's such a bit of jargon, but what I mean by the reflexive age is an age where actors in society understand what it is that makes systems work. There is this kind of reflexive capacity to look at organizations, society as a whole, and think and understand what it is that makes them work as organizations and systems. So to have that kind of much more systemic view of things, and to recognize what goes to make a system that works, but also that within that overall system, there is a reflexivity in each part of it. So that is to say that when it comes to authority, we have leaders who are aware of the contradictions within the notion of leadership. And as I say, I can't really get into this, but there is we need leadership, but yet leadership contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction and its own destructiveness, right? Equally, solidarity, which is something that drives us to act in an other regarding way. The systems of solidarity, the systems of civil society also contain their own contradictory qualities, a certain tribalism, a certain internalness, a certain resistance to change. And so the institutions of civil society and of belonging and of solidarity also have this reflexive awareness of the dangers of these things as well as their inspirational form. And then thirdly, and of course, in a way, most obviously now, actually, individualism, the power of our own individual aspirations and dreams, and we are aware of our own contradictory nature as individuals. And this is where one of the reasons I'm hopeful for this reflexive age is that we have really learned a lot in the last 20 years about the fact that we are not, perfectly informed, rational utility maximizers, that human beings are very contradictory, that we are navigating a modern world with a prehistorically evolved brain, and that actually on autonomy, genuine autonomy, is not just about freedom and being rich and having power and spending money. Genuine autonomy is about understanding, having that reflexive capacity to understand the human condition, right? So my aspiration is that the world that is created after COVID is this reflexive world, more deeply aware of systems and more deeply aware within the system of how we need each of these forms of power, but that each of them is contradictory, is self-destructive, is other-destructive, and then therefore it is only through the continuous process of reflexivity that we achieve the best for humanity.
Brilliant. Let me pick up from there. First of all, I just want to say I've looked in who's in attendance to this group, and I know there's lots of old friends within there. So it's really good to see you all, those of you who know me. And please do always be in touch. And thanks to Immy and the team for organising this and inviting Matthew and I. I want to sort of pick up the sort of the historical flow of Matthew's arguments, and maybe in the conversation we'll go back to the sort of psychology, systems, institutions conversation, because I think there's something interesting in the historical moment that we're in, and there's sort of risks and opportunities that might be worth sort of thinking through. Now, I have an inkling that actually that the financial crisis and COVID have a sort of historical connection. Don't necessarily have the same root causes, or maybe they do in a connected world where financial viruses as well as biological viruses can spread quite quickly. But I think there's a linking word between the two experiences, and that's the notion of vulnerability. And there are other vulnerabilities as well that are coming to bear and will come to bear. The climate degradation, a climate emergency. We will all become acutely aware of our vulnerability to ecological forces. And there is a vulnerability around inequalities. Obviously, the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis in many ways is a story of vulnerability of a particular group of people faced with vulnerability in the face of the arbitrary power of state forces in many respects. And obviously that's playing into a conversation around equality of different ethnicities, which is critical. But the sense of vulnerability is something which is gathering in multiple dimensions. And while Matthew was speaking, I was recalling Brené Brown And I have to confess, I did dip into the internet just to remind myself. But she talks about sort of 3 responses to vulnerability as being healthy responses. One is courage. You know, you face the truth, you're honest with yourself. The second is compassion. You have regard for others. You see things from their perspective. You empathize. And the third is connection. You reach out. You seek help and you give help. Now, it seems to me that our response to the first iteration of this crisis of vulnerability, if that is indeed what we're in, the financial crisis, the populist response, did almost the opposite to courage, compassion, and connection. It displayed sort of weakness. We wanted to believe convenient truths rather than hard truths. That we resorted to blame rather than compassion. Blame for other people, other forces, people within society. We divided ourselves. You know, the strivers and the skivers style approach to politics. And thirdly, there was a sense of disconnection. We hunkered down, held on to what we could, rather than reaching out. And I think the big risk now is actually in this sort of second phase of vulnerability, that we recoil rather than renew, that we don't reach out for that sort of reflexive age that Matthew described. You know, and it's trivial, but you can't help noticing the queues, you know, and the crowds at sort of Bicester Village and so on and so forth. I'm not sort of giving a hard time people go to Bicester Village. I go there when I need a cheap suit myself. But you know, you do wonder whether, you know, all the conversation about this revolutionary moment, the ideas, the change, the renewal, whatever, how quickly that might dissipate, and that's got to be a fear. So how can we, as people generally who want to see change, who want to see a greater sense of equity, of fairness, of justice, of progress, of connection, of relationships, what can we hold on to that can hopefully pull back against that recoil and maybe even snap that spring over time? Now, rather than present new ideas, I'm going to take some old ideas and repackage them a bit. But I've been spending far too much time thinking about the work of Jürgen Habermas over the last year, for which apologies. But there's something which is very deep within he's a German philosopher and social theorist, in case you haven't come across him, but he's got a very core set of ideas, it seems to me, in a very wide-reaching sweep of thinking around the intersection of life worlds, as he described it. And in the life world is where we have friendship, we have family, a sense of neighborhood, of community, of belonging. It's, you know, where we find meaning in our lives, and systems. And this, I think, probably does relate very closely to Matthew's thinking around sort of psychology and the social brain and systems and organizations. But he describes 2 systems: a system of money and a system of power. And it seems to me that what we've been increasingly experiencing is the system of money impinging on the life world. You now need 2 salaries rather than 1 in order to look after your family, for a lot of families. And you know, it's kind of like the need to sort of make ends meet is occupying an ever greater part of our lives in a way that intrudes on those life worlds. The system of power seems remote. It doesn't seem reflexive. It doesn't seem responsive to a rich sort of democratic dialogue. It seems far more respondent to sort of emotive impulses. Again, going back to that sort of weakness, blame, and disconnection analysis. And I'd say there's 2 other big systems that Habermas didn't talk about, which are, I think, are important. One is the system of technology, which I think we all feel is intruding deeper and deeper into our lives in quite a manipulative way. You know, there's a lot of sort of conversation around surveillance, capitalism, and so on. But what it's all about is about getting into our core psychology and manipulating us in many ways. Technology offers many opportunities for connection and so on and so forth. But as it's being experienced at the moment, it's intruding ever more into the life world. And the problem with this is actually what we should be looking to is actually how do we expand our life world into the system of money, the economy? How do we make that more humanistic, balanced with our human needs to care, to develop, to learn, to connect, to relate? How do we ensure that power responds to our needs equally? Technology is empowering of us and what's important to our humanity, rather than seeking sometimes to manipulate us. And the fourth system is ecology, which I think is very different in the biosphere, because in this system, actually, we are the problem rather than the system being a problem. Our life worlds are impinging on an environmental good and a safe environment and a diverse environment and a regenerative environment and so on. So the challenge then becomes, it seems to me, in this response to the era of vulnerability, is ways in which we can put blockers around the life world and expand it wherever possible. And I'm just going to sort of present 3 or 4 key things that might be areas where there could be some cooperation. And I'm very aware that this is a very pluralistic conversation. So, I'm not putting this out there as a manifesto, really, more sort of things that can respond to the moment. And you'd expect me to talk around about basic income, but economic security, again, thinking about the life world and relationship with the system of money. Something about basic income, which is an income beyond the market, enables you to have greater power in relation to your working life, that enables you to care, to learn, to develop, to try new things, to experiment, to have voice within the workplace even. So that seems to me an important consideration. It's not all that's required. We need systems of deeper care, and that's been highlighted very obviously in the last few months, and systems that support our ability to learn and so on and so forth. So it's not a magic bullet, but I think there's something about economic security that expands the life world and the time and space we have available to us. And secondly, I think there's something around places and their ability to safeguard what's of value, to invest in the things that are important to us. We've got a piece coming out next week around community banking and community finance. It might seem fairly sort of esoteric, but I think the community wealth building agenda is an important one. And we need to think about how we can democratize the asset base to support small businesses, individuals, ensure there is greater financial security in a place that places can invest in their future in creative ways. It's too fragmented at the moment. There's a lack of diversity in what we can do. So how can we democratize capital in localities to enable places to build good life places to support the life world? And the third thing, which I think we need to sort of have a deep conversation around, of course, is climate change and the response to the climate emergency. I think there's something around coronavirus that sort of hints at what's going to be needed really to confront it. And by the way, it's absolutely terrifying to me that we've basically shut down the developed world economy and the net gain has only been a reduction in emissions of about 16%. It shows what an enormous distance we have to travel. So we need to be darn serious about this. And what's necessary is enormously open and transparent and deep international collaboration, local innovation within circular economies around food, around products, obviously PPE and the supply of that. There is redundant manufacturing capacity in a textile industry that hasn't been deployed to protect our health and care workers in the past few weeks. How can we think about more circular economies, community energy? I know Dark Matter Labs have been thinking a lot about this, and that links into some of the community investment as well. And finally, we need to change our human behaviours in the context of climate change in ways that is more challenging of ourselves. And finally, we need to think about democracy in a deeper form of democracy, a richer form of democracy, not just an impulsive, emotive form of democracy, but one where we develop our understanding, where we come together. Matthew has spoken extensively, written extensively, and is one of the leading advocates of deliberative democratic forms, citizen assemblies, citizen juries, and so on. But they seem to me absolutely important. If we're going to capture a spirit of renewal and have the energy for that, we need to collectively develop as citizens. We need to ensure that it's not just voices like us in the conversation, I hasten to add, that those who are economically insecure and are more distant from voice and power and so on are genuinely able to participate in a way that is enriching in a democratic conversation, whether that be locally, nationally, or beyond. So I think there are big areas where there is opportunity for deep collaboration, albeit in a pluralistic, discordant, energetic space. And it's around sort of expanding the individual life worlds, our families' life worlds, our places, really leaning in with a degree of greater seriousness and sophistication to the climate emergency, and in creating those spaces where democratic conversation can flourish and form. And if we do that, we might be able to respond in a more convincing way to an era of vulnerability. So just some ideas for the conversation there.
Thank you both. And thanks for coming to this with the spirit that the festival is about, which is, right this second, we're probably not looking for answers. We're trying to have so many different points of view and thoughts and approaches and experiences and visions and dreams, and look at how we can weave together and see where the common themes are, what is emerging. So we've got just under 15 minutes, and so we've got enough time to do a few questions. I'm going to kick off with one, and then we'll move into a couple of others. Matthew, over the last few weeks, I've seen you talking to people in Taiwan. Over this festival, we've had quite a lot of conversation about New Zealand's approach. I was just wondering, are there any examples from that work or from the work that you're seeing that is glimmers or glimpses of this reflexive age that you talk about, or what are you seeing there that's giving you hope about the future? And that's linked to a question that somebody else has also asked about, where sorry, I've lost it in the thread now, but where are you seeing some examples of this reflexive age starting to emerge?
So I think if we look at who's done best, I think that I would say there are kind of three characteristics. Firstly, there is just capacity. So there is capacity in the government system and more widely in civil society to respond to what's happening. And I think that part of the problem in Britain actually was a lack of capacity in many ways. And that's a kind of, when I talk about lack of capacity, that's got a complex idea. It's not just a particular skill or a particular resource. It's a deeper kind of lack of capacity or resilience in the system. So first of all, the places that cope well seem to have had sufficient capacity. Secondly, they have had reasonably trusting relationships between governments and citizens. And thirdly, quite often they seem to have a reasonably devolved administration, so that has actually been the ability of cities or of states to be able to respond and to take the leadership locally, because they're just kind of, the lower tiers of government are closer to people. What I find interesting is that when it comes to this notion of the reflexive age, is that if you look at Thailand and South Korea, both of those countries, and I didn't know this, which is a kind of, I'm afraid, a rather shameful reflection of the parochialism of somebody I'm really interested in policy, and I just become aware of how ignorant I've been of some of the stuff that's been going on in East Asia for the last few years. I was kind of vaguely aware of it, but not properly. In both Taiwan and South Korea, in the last 10 years, been moments of public uprising. It was the Sunflower Revolution in Taiwan, which was an uprising against the government signing a big trade deal with China and allowing the Chinese state corporations to come in and kind of run the technological infrastructure. And there was a student pushback against that. And that led to real change. And it led to people like Audrey Tang, who's a person I interviewed on my podcast, coming into government with a really different approach. She's somebody who describes herself as a conservative anarchist. And then in South Korea, there was also problems with the response to a previous pandemic and other things that went wrong, which also led to some quite deep soul searching and quite deep reform. And I think also Jacinda Ardern is just one of those leaders who I think is instinctively aware of some of the kinds of problems with the very idea of leadership. And she has a kind of reflexive ability to talk about herself and what she's trying to do in an incredibly open and authentic way. So I would say that what you've seen in the places that have worked is that they have been through a process that has required them to think quite deeply about themselves and about what they do and how they operate. And I think that is part of That's part of what I would mean by this reflexivity. I'd say an area where it's really not happening, but where it is in relation to this kind of the zone of solidarity. And I think that what we've seen is, powerful movements around justice and identity, which are for the good and are important. But there is, I think, a conversation we need to try to have about how it is we live together. And, I think everybody wants to have that conversation, the conversation about how we live together, but we don't seem to know how to have it right now. And there is one view, which I think is entirely legitimate, which says, well, we can't have it yet because the injustice is so great and people's anger and hurt is so great that we can't have that conversation yet. And I kind of get that, but I kind of think it's also a dead end. I think we have to somehow have the conversation which says, how can we have our identities? How can we articulate our collective feelings, but yet do it always with a mind to the fact that ultimately we have to find a way of living together? And that means being both of a tribe, and I'm in loads of tribes, both being of a tribe, but also understanding that tribalism is problematic and has always to be interrogated, because otherwise it consumes itself. So I think that's going to be a really hard, and I think the left doesn't know quite how to do that at the moment. It's a very complicated issue, which I also kind of recognize that me as a member of the tribe of white middle-aged men who've been running the world for the last kind of 200 years is probably not the best person to kind of be kicking this off. But I think it's something that we have to start to generate.
No, I completely agree in the wider story of how we bring many, like the 6 days is really about bringing many different voices together and sitting in the discomfort of questions like, well, one reason why we can't figure out how to live together right now is because we're literally being killed at the hands of the state, right? Like, and to have these conversations and to sit in the discomfort and to vision and dream together and weave together as well. So, Anthony, Matthew mentioned a couple of leaders and some of the key traits that he'd seen about this reflexive age, and we've got some questions in from the audience around one from Jess Prendergast and another one from George Richardson, which is, do we need a different type? And another one that's linked from Deborah that talks about the political leadership we need for this reflexive age, the leadership style we need for this. And George Richardson also talks about what gives you faith that people will respond positively to a leadership and culture that is reflexive, honest and humble, as opposed to continuing to place faith in loud and strong political leaders. I mean, I've got some answers to what gives me faith about that, given some of the conversations we've had live in from New Zealand, where I actually thought, I wonder if a lot of that is propaganda and it's not quite as it's made out. And then hearing from people who are working over there, Penny Hagen, who you might know, to say, no, actually, one of the things that we can, and then an Indigenous leader, Angie Tangeri, who said, one of the things that we actually, I want to say is I'm grateful for our Prime Minister. I'm grateful for her approach in multiple emergencies. And I've said it multiple times on this because I want people to keep hearing it. As someone of my age, I found it's something moved in me to hear someone say they were proud of their country's response to something, which made me realize how little I have viscerally felt that in my entire adult life. So I want to sort of open up to you, Anthony, about some of this. What do we need to do here?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Citra Adair. I mean, she seems accessible, able to communicate conversationally in a humble way, and being authoritative and taking action and being decisive at certain moments. This plays into Matthew's cultural theory in many respects, but she seems to have a sense of what's required when to play in a different way. And I guess to answer your question around what gives me hope that people will respond to more humble leadership, I think that two things. One, we've tried the authoritative stuff, and we've seen where we are. We're no further forward. And actually, and sorry to be parochial, but in a UK context, over the past few months, it's been pretty disastrous because the governance system doesn't respond, and it's incredibly centralized. There's a really important point made this morning, it was by Martin Wolf in the FT, that the fact is with Trump in America, you've got the state and city governments as well. So if something goes wrong at the federal, badly wrong as it has, there's still some other channels for governance to do the right thing. In the UK, we haven't got that. If it goes wrong at the top, if action is too slovenly or ineffective, or the systems aren't right, we're kind of stuck with it. So I think there is something, and I'm not concerned with sort of partisan thing, but there is something around that form of leadership which has palpably failed, and that has been the primary response to that sort of era of vulnerability. And the second thing I'd say is, there has to come a point, and this is a Hegel point, where people are sick and tired of the notion that dignity and esteem is something which is zero sum. That if I have dignity and esteem, that means you can't have it. That it's a choice. There's a sort of set pool of dignity, status, and esteem to be shared around, as opposed to something which can be universal, and then we live our lives on the basis of it. And there's got to be a way of communicative, articulate leadership connecting on that notion, because the notion it is a zero-sum game is palpably ridiculous. So let's have a different, more universal type of conversation, and maybe that'll be a better starting point.
One bit of hope I would add to that is I'm immediately after this talk going to do a speech to the Progressive Governance Conference, which is being hosted by a German think tank and is kind of the old European social democratic establishment to an extent, but also they brought in newer voices. And I would say the European Union is going through a reflexive moment. The recognition of how it failed after the global financial crisis, the recognition that it failed at the beginning of this COVID crisis. There was a terrible failure right at the beginning to recognize the scale of what was going on and an attempt to do things business as usual. And then there's this moment, a moment when after the European Central Bank looked like it was going to do nothing to help Italy, there was a kind of moment of revulsion, and people said, no, for God's sake, we can't fail again in the task of solidarity. And so the European Union has had its Hamilton moment, now it's sharing debt. It's talking very seriously about a baseline for tax across the whole continent. It's recognizing you cannot have governance without solidarity and without mechanisms of solidarity. And it's really interesting. German public opinion, which was profoundly opposed to helping the Greeks, and was one of the reasons why Greece was left, hung out to dry, is in a very different place now. And so that the European Union is an example of an institution that is learning about itself and is growing and is developing in a way which is encouraging and feels quite different to the quality of discourse in our own country. And of course, tragically, I'm only watching that now from the outside.
Thank you so much, both. I want to thank everyone in the audience who've been sharing lots of comments. I want to say, three things that stood out for me in this. Min has put one in the chat, which is dignity and esteem as a zero-sum game is palpably ridiculous. And I think there's something really important that we can reflect on that in terms of our own lives and the way we work. I'm really interested in this idea of not being able to have governance without mechanisms of solidarity. And, one of the things that we look to, or I look to for institutions like the RSA, and I think I said to you this, Matthew, during this a call during this COVID crisis, never before have I realised why I appreciate the RSA so much, because it sits there, right? It sits there as an institution, and it does loads of things. And when things feel okay, you're kind of like, oh, okay, all right. But the minute that your government feels like you have no idea where the ideas are coming from, where the history or wisdom from how we've run things before, and what tools we have at our fingertips now, and the future looks like, and then the way you keep bringing glimmers and glimpses of that future Audrey Tang and the principles you talked about, some of the work that I've seen you bring together from basic income experiments and from the work of Jacinda Ardern, and looking at examples like New Zealand and how they're responding. This stuff really matters, right? And I think a younger me didn't realise this because things felt a bit more stable. And now you kind of realise that actually, where are these ideas? Where is this work happening? Who is showing us the glimpses of the future? So on that note, I want to say thank you for that. To all of you in the chat, check out some of the RSA shorts, check out some of the talks, follow the blogs, because you know what, all the answers aren't there, but there's definitely a lot of synthesis of some of the next steps we need to take. And I don't think many of us who are younger here realised how important that is in a time where it feels like our government is having a bit of a ridiculous response. So Anthony and Matthew, I know you have other stuff to get to. I want to say thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be back with a mind-bending afternoon with dark matter of experiments and talks from Indy Johar. See you all soon.